Sophia had always been fascinated by history, which made her decision to attend Salem University a no-brainer. The idea of studying in a place so rich in history, especially with its infamous connection to the Salem witch trials, thrilled her. However, her excitement was tempered by a sense of unease as she arrived at Salem Hall, her assigned dormitory. Salem Hall was one of the oldest buildings on campus. Its Gothic architecture, complete with towering spires and ivy-covered walls, gave it a hauntingly beautiful appearance. As Sophia walked through the grand entrance, she couldn't shake the feeling that the building was watching her, as though it had a life of its own. Her room was on the top floor, with a small window that overlooked the dense woods behind the hall. The air inside was thick, and the walls seemed to close in on her as she unpacked her belongings. The room was sparsely furnished with a creaky bed, a wooden desk, and a wardrobe that looked like it had been there for centuries. As Sophia settled in, she couldn't help but notice the strange markings etched into the wooden floorboards near her bed. They looked like symbols, almost like runes, and they sent a chill down her spine. She tried to brush it off as an overactive imagination, a side effect of reading too many ghost stories. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard faint whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The whispers were indistinct, like a conversation just out of earshot. Sophia sat up, straining to hear, but the whispers ceased as soon as she moved. The room fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the old building settling. Sophia tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, she felt as though she was being watched. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were filled with strange images of women in dark clothing, their faces twisted in anger and fear. The next day, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She went about her classes, but her mind kept drifting back to the strange occurrences in her room. She decided to visit the campus library after class, hoping to find some information about the history of Salem Hall. The library was an ancient building in its own right, filled with dusty tomes and musty old papers. Sophia approached the librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes and a knowing smile. "Can I help you with something, dear?" the librarian asked. "Yes, I'm staying at Salem Hall, and I was curious about its history," Sophia replied. The librarian's smile faltered for a moment, and her eyes grew serious. "Salem Hall, you say? That building has quite the history, and not all of it is pleasant." Sophia's curiosity was piqued. The librarian led her to a secluded section of the library, where she pulled out an old leather-bound book. The cover was worn and the pages were yellowed with age. "This is a record of the history of Salem Hall, going back to when it was first built in the late 1600s, the librarian explained. "But there's one part of its history that most people don't know." As Sophia flipped through the pages, she found references to the Salem witch trials. According to the book, the land on which Salem Hall was built had once been the site of an execution ground where several women accused of witchcraft had been hanged. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves, lost to time. Sophia felt a shiver run down her spine as she read on. The book mentioned that one of the women, a young healer named Abigail, had been particularly vocal in proclaiming her innocence. She had cursed the town with her dying breath, vowing to return and seek vengeance on those who wronged her. "What happened to Abigail?" Sophia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one knows for certain," the librarian said, her voice hushed. "But there are stories, rumors really, that her spirit never found peace. Some say she still wanders the grounds where she died, seeking retribution." Sophia's heart pounded in her chest. She thanked the librarian and left the library, her mind racing. Could the strange occurrences in her room be connected to Abigail's restless spirit? That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. Sophia lay in bed, her heart racing as the disembodied voices seemed to swirl around her. She tried to make out the words, but they were a jumbled mix of anger and sorrow. Suddenly, her room grew cold and the temperature dropped so quickly that she could see her breath in the air. The window rattled as if something was trying to force its way inside. Sophia pulled the covers tighter around her, praying for the whispers to stop. But they didn't. Instead, they grew louder, until Sophia could make out a single word repeated over and over: justice. Sophia bolted upright in bed, her eyes darting around the room. She could feel a presence, something dark and malevolent, lurking just out of sight. It felt as though the walls themselves were closing in on her, suffocating her with their weight. Panicking, she grabbed her phone and called her best friend, Emily, who lived in another dorm on campus. "Emily, something's wrong," Sophia whispered into the phone, trying to keep her voice steady. "Sophia, what's going on?" Emily asked, her voice filled with concern. "I think my dorm is haunted," Sophia said, her voice trembling. "There's something here, something angry. I don't know what to do." "Okay, calm down," Emily said, trying to reassure her. "I'll come over right now. Just stay where you are." Sophia hung up the phone, her heart still pounding in her chest. She knew she had to find out more about Abigail and the curse that plagued Salem Hall. But how? The whispers continued to haunt her, growing more intense with each passing night. The next day, Sophia and Emily decided to dig deeper into the history of Salem Hall. They returned to the library, where they spent hours poring over old records and documents. Finally, they stumbled upon an old newspaper article that caught their attention. The article, dated from the early 1900s, described a series of mysterious deaths that had occurred at Salem Hall. Several students had died under strange circumstances with no apparent cause of death. The article mentioned that the students had all reported hearing strange whispers and feeling an ominous presence before their deaths. "This is it," Sophia said, her voice shaking. "This is proof that something's wrong with Salem Hall." Emily nodded, her face pale. "But what do we do? How do we stop it?" As they continued to research, they came across a reference to an old ritual, supposedly designed to appease the spirits of those who had died unjustly. The ritual involved lighting candles and reciting a specific incantation, asking for forgiveness and offering peace to the restless souls. "It's worth a try," Sophia said, her voice determined. "We have to do something." That night, armed with candles and a copy of the incantation, Sophia and Emily returned to Salem Hall. The air was thick with tension as they entered the building, and the whispers seemed to grow louder with each step they took. They made their way to Sophia's room, where they set up the candles in a circle and began to recite the incantation. As they spoke the words, the temperature in the room dropped even further, and the whispers intensified, filling the room with a cacophony of angry voices. But Sophia and Emily didn't stop. They continued the incantation, their voices growing louder as they pleaded for peace. Suddenly, the room was filled with a blinding light, and the whispers ceased. The cold air lifted, and the oppressive feeling that had plagued the room vanished. For a moment, there was silence, and Sophia dared to hope that they had succeeded. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw a figure standing by the window. It was Abigail. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and her expression one of unrelenting anger. She stared at Sophia, her presence filling the room with a sense of dread. "You think this will stop me?" Abigail's voice was cold, echoing through the room. "I have waited centuries for justice, and it will not be denied." Sophia's blood ran cold as she realized that the ritual had only made things worse. Abigail's spirit was not at peace, it was more vengeful than ever. Before Sophia could react, Abigail lunged toward her, her form dissipating into a cloud of darkness that enveloped the room. The candles were snuffed out, plunging the room into pitch blackness. Sophia and Emily screamed, their voices swallowed by the darkness. They could feel Abigail's presence all around them, suffocating them, driving them to the brink of madness. In the midst of the chaos, Sophia heard Abigail's voice clear and cutting through the darkness. Justice will be served. Sophia woke the next morning to find herself lying on the floor of her room. The candles were melted stubs and Emily was nowhere to be found. Panic surged through her as she scrambled to her feet, calling out for her friend, but there was no response. Sophia knew that Abigail had taken Emily just as she had taken the others who had crossed her path. She couldn't let Abigail win, she had to fight back. It was just after sunset when Lucia moved into the historic college hostel in Buenos Aires. The hostel, an old mansion turned student residence, stood in the heart of the city, its grand facade an elegant remnant of a bygone era. The building had a certain charm, with its high ceilings, ornate moldings, and sweeping staircases. But there was also something about it that felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were weighed down by history. Lucia had always been drawn to old buildings, fascinated by their stories and the lives that had passed through them. So when she had the opportunity to study abroad in Argentina, she chose this hostel without a second thought. It was exactly the kind of place where she felt she could immerse herself in the culture and history of the city. As she unpacked her belongings, she couldn't help but feel a slight chill in the air, despite the warm evening. The large windows of her room overlooked the courtyard, where the trees cast long, flickering shadows across the cobblestones. Lucia pushed the feeling aside, attributing it to the nervous excitement of being in a new place. The first few nights passed uneventfully. Lucia spent her days exploring Buenos Aires and her evenings studying in her room. She quickly made friends with some of the other students staying at the hostel, and they would often gather in the common room to chat and share stories. But then, one night, something strange happened. Lucia was lying in bed reading a book when she felt a sudden drop in temperature. She pulled the blanket tighter around her, wondering if the old building's heating system was faulty. As she looked up from her book, she caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye, a figure pale and indistinct standing by the window. Lucia's heart skipped a beat. She turned her head quickly, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, just as it had been moments before. She shook her head, convinced that she had imagined it. But the sense of unease lingered, and it took her a long time to fall asleep that night. Over the next few days, Lucia continued to experience odd occurrences. She would catch glimpses of the same ghostly figure, a woman dressed in white, just out of the corner of her eye. The figure never stayed long enough for her to get a good look, always disappearing the moment she turned her head. The other students in the hostel noticed Lucia's growing unease. When she finally confided in them about what she had seen, they exchanged nervous glances. "You're not the first to see her," one of the students, a local named Mateo, said quietly. "They say the hostel is haunted by the ghost of a woman who died here many years ago." Lucia felt a shiver run down her spine. Who was she? "No one knows for sure," Mateo replied, "but there are rumors. Some say she was a maid who worked here when the building was still a mansion. Others say she was the wife of the original owner. All the stories agree on one thing, though she died tragically, and her spirit has never found peace." The idea of a ghostly presence lurking in the hostel sent chills through Lucia. She tried to focus on her studies, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The glimpses of the woman in white became more frequent, and the chill in the air seemed to follow her wherever she went. One evening, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Lucia decided to do some research. She visited the local library and began digging through old records, hoping to uncover the truth about the hostel's history. What she found only deepened the mystery. The mansion that now served as the hostel had been built in the late 19th century by a wealthy landowner named Don Esteban. According to the records, Don Esteban had married a beautiful young woman named Isabella, who came from a humble background. Their marriage was the talk of the town, with many gossiping about how the wealthy Don Esteban had fallen for a commoner. But their love story was far from a fairy tale. The records hinted at a dark and tragic end. Isabella had died under mysterious circumstances, and there were whispers of betrayal and murder. Some believed that Don Esteban had discovered an affair and, in a fit of rage, had killed Isabella. Others said she had taken her own life out of despair. As Lucia read these accounts, she felt a deep sadness for Isabella. The more she learned about the woman's tragic life, the more convinced she became that the ghost she had seen was Isabella's restless spirit. That night, as Lucia lay in bed, the temperature in her room dropped again. She felt a familiar chill wash over her, and she knew she wasn't alone. This time she didn't turn away. She sat up in bed, her eyes scanning the room, and there, by the window, stood the ghostly figure of a woman dressed in white. The woman's face was pale and sorrowful, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. She looked directly at Lucia, as if pleading for help. For a moment the room was silent, and then the woman's lips moved, but no sound came out. Lucia's heart pounded in her chest. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The woman didn't respond, but Lucia felt a sudden urge to follow her. She slipped out of bed and, without thinking, walked towards the door. The ghostly figure drifted ahead of her, leading her through the dark and silent halls of the hostel. They passed through the common room, up a narrow staircase, and down a hallway that Lucia had never seen before. The walls here were different, older, with faded wallpaper and cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. It was as if they had stepped back in time. Finally, they stopped in front of a heavy wooden door. The woman in white gestured towards it, and Lucia hesitated for a moment before reaching out and pushing it open. The room beyond was dark and cold, the air thick with the scent of old wood and dust. In the center of the room stood an old, ornate bed, its curtains drawn back to reveal a figure lying motionless on the mattress. Lucia's breath caught in her throat. The figure was the ghostly woman, but this time she looked different. She was solid, real, and there was blood staining the front of her white dress. Her eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling, and her face was twisted in pain. Lucia realized with a start that she was looking at the moment of Isabella's death. The room seemed to pulse with the energy of that tragic event, and Lucia felt a wave of sorrow wash over her. She turned back to the ghostly figure, who now stood beside the bed, her eyes filled with desperation. Lucia understood what she had to do. She had to help Isabella find peace. In a voice barely above a whisper, Lucia spoke. "Isabella, I'm sorry for what happened to you. You didn't deserve this. But you don't have to suffer anymore. You can let go." The ghostly figure seemed to waver, her form flickering like a candle in the wind. For a moment it looked as though she might disappear, but then she solidified again, her eyes locked onto Lucia's. Lucia took a deep breath. "You're free now, you can rest." Isabella's ghost stared at her for a long moment, and then slowly she began to fade. The air in the room grew warmer, and the heavy feeling that had hung over the hostel lifted. Lucia felt a sense of peace wash over her as Isabella's spirit finally found rest. She turned and left the room, the door closing softly behind her. When she returned to her own room, the chill was gone, and the air was warm and comforting. From that night on, Lucia never saw the ghostly figure again. The hostel felt lighter, the halls no longer filled with whispers and shadows. She knew that Isabella had found the peace she had long sought. But as Lucia continued her studies at the hostel, she couldn't help but think about the tragic love story that had played out within its walls. The story of Isabella, a woman who had been betrayed by the man she loved and whose spirit had lingered in search of justice. Lucia would never forget Isabella or the night she had helped her find peace. The experience had left a deep impression on her, a reminder of the power of love and the pain of betrayal. And though the hostel was no longer haunted, its history would always be a part of it, woven into the fabric of the building and the lives of those who stayed there. The story of Isabella and her tragic end would live on, a ghostly echo of the past, reminding all who heard it that some spirits never truly leave. If you want to see more horror stories, please like the video, share your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel. Stay with us, thank you, and see you in the next videos.